Hello and thanks for joining me. Today I want to do a quick chat on the jazz of physics. And after I finish this book chat, I'm going to touch briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as I'm going to do a drawing to let the universe choose my next book to read. If you haven't seen my last few videos, I'm reading off of a list, and so I'm just letting the randomness of the universe choose my books. But the jazz of physics, the secret link between music and the structure of the universe by Stephon Alexander. I finished this recently. And I chose this work. This work, by the way, it was published in 2016. This is a nonfiction work. So I chose this work because I wanted to read. I wanted to get on my reading list for this year a work based in science. And so when I came across this one was sort of really sounded intriguing because it also had a double interest, which was associating jazz with physics. So I thought I would give it a go. And I'm really glad I did. I really got a lot from it. There was the book itself is about the journey, really. It's kind of almost a memoir of Stephon Alexander. Stephon Alexander is a physicist and I guess an experimental theoretical physicist. And he is a professor at Brown University right now. The story is, like I said, kind of told in a memoir, kind of his journey from a young boy in the Bronx. He is the child of immigrants from Trinidad, and he brought that experience, I think, to his love of, or his grandmother anyway, really was musical, and she wanted to sort of instill a love of music in him and encouraged him to take up, I believe it was the piano first, but then later he migrated over to the saxophone. But he had this interest in music, as well as he early on developed an interest in physics and decided, to pursue that. Then as he was a little older, he realized that Einstein and Kepler and had used music as a creative sort of source for them in their thinking. And so that sort of inspired him, because he felt like, he instinctively felt this sort of connection, I think, between music and physics and what he was learning in physics. And so, he really wanted to explore that connection more. And he was really, I think his life he was really enriched by that. And it caused him to think in kind of strange ways. He really took a lesson from Einstein, who had these things called Gedanken experiments. And these were Einstein's kind of thought experiments. Like, for example, he would think about what it would be like to ride a light wave. And then so Stephon Alexander then has sort of the same sort of thing where he really places jazz and the structures of jazz and things like this with different aspects of cosmology. So he goes into that pretty in depth. I mean, the book is very conversational, so I could follow the narrative pretty well. He does include a lot of calculations, and I am not a person who has a scientific mind when it comes to mathematics and physics and this kind of thing. So I think I understood what he was getting at with through the narrative. He does warn the reader at the beginning, if you don't understand the equations, to not get bogged down in them. They're just sort of there for reference, and they are beautiful to look at, but they're just, mathematics is a language of its own, isn't it? And so is jazz, he argues in this book. So jazz is a musical language, and pervades really everything. And I think, some of the mysteries of music, I think are just so sort of really interesting, like what's harmonic to us, what, notes played together seem harmonious to us, and some notes played together are not. So John Coltrane, the great jazz musician and one of Stephon Alexander's, really his idols, explored this idea a lot in his life, especially in his later life. And he came up with this musical diagram with the notes of the scale and how they all relate to each other. And it's quite beautiful. There's a picture of it in the book. There's a copyright notice, though, on the image that says the image can't be used for anything except this particular book. So right at that instance. So I kind of got the impression they didn't really, it wasn't really cool to share that, so I don't think I'll put that up. But if you Google John Coltrane's music mandala, you might be able to find it. It's quite beautiful. And then as he goes on and talks about improvisation, so that was one of the takeaways that I had from the book, was this idea of improvisation, because I didn't really know a lot about jazz improvisation. I kind of thought it was just kind of random music, but it's not. There's a structure to it. A jazz musician has to usually do years of study and practice before they're able to improvise, and this really reminded me of rhetoric, like how like maybe public speaking, we would call it today, where you would need to learn that skill. You would need to learn a lot about language and a lot about language structure in order to then be able to stand up in front of a crowd and improvise, when someone throws a question at you, to then eloquently improvise a response to it. To me, that's jazz improvisation, where you're in a jazz set with a group of other musicians, and then it comes time for your solo. You have to pick up the argument where they left off and take it somewhere on your own, but it has to fit with the whole conversation, what you say musically. So I thought that was real cool, and that sort of analogy, he described himself as a thinker in analogies, and I really identified with that, because this is how I think too. So I just gave you an analogy between jazz improvisation and grammar and public speaking, and that's how my mind operates too. I'm always generally, I learn by making these sort of connections with other things, and so I really identified with him in this regard. He didn't always feel comfortable in the world of natural sciences and physics, though. Sometimes he felt like an outsider because he felt like he was thinking too outside the box sometimes, and he describes some of his anxieties around that in the book in this sort of memoirish way. But I really could identify with that, because, well, I don't feel insecure about it because I'm not in the natural sciences in this area where I'm sort of forced into this hard math all the time. But still, I could identify with thinking this way. One other thing was, making that connection between different fields. That really reminded me of, speaking of analogies, is the glass bead game, the Magister Ludi by Hermann Hesse, that I did a book chat on earlier this year, or actually at the end of last year, but I've mentioned several times on my channel, where the glass bead game in that book is putting these different parts of knowledge together that haven't, the connection between them hasn't been established until that point. So I thought that was really cool too. So I'm going to run out of time pretty soon if I'm not careful. I need to be careful and mindful. But I did want to bring up about improvisation, an analogy, and Einstein, Gedanken experiments. I thought all of those were really cool. But one thing, I did want to read a quote before I run out of time that he brings up in this book and talks about in this book a lot, like resonance, these sort of ideas, terms like resonance. We have an idea of that musically, like a given violin has a certain resonance, and resonance also is an applicable term in physics. And so a lot of these sort of things are, there is a relation. I can definitely understand the relation between physics and jazz after reading this book as he describes it. But what he was talking about at one point in the book really struck me, because it was about a tone, a single tone, about the origin of the universe, and sort of the cyclical nature as a theory. There's a cyclical nature of the universe where it comes and goes, and when it's doing this, it emits a single tone, sort of like a white noise. It's like the cosmic background radiation, maybe this. Well, not that, but a single tone. And so I wanted to read this quote because I made it such an awesome connection to me anyway, that I want to share it on my video. So it says here, with the analogy of our universe functioning like an instrument that can tune itself to play the cosmic composition of stars, galaxies, and eventually life, it must have a means to achieve this self-tuning. By taking the musical universe analogy seriously, I proposed a harmonic or cyclical universe as a potential solution to this fine-tuning problem. We saw that if the universe underwent infinite successions of expansions and contractions like a pure tone, then the constants of nature can self-tune by improvising new values during the bounce between contraction and expansion. So he's saying here, you know, the universe is this single tone, and then it comes into being, and then it all the matters forms and this kind of thing, and you know, it creates new forms. This, to me, is a perfect description of the Prelude to Das Rheingold, the opera by Richard Wagner that's part of the Ring cycle. And I'm going to put a link to that below, and I encourage everyone to listen to this sort of single tone. It starts with a single tone. If you're not familiar with the opera, what it's describing here is the birth of the universe and the birth of the gods of Valhalla. And it starts out with a single tone that goes on for quite some time, and then there's more complexity, you know, until the earth is born, and then ultimately the gods themselves are put in place. You know, it's this passage of time in the evolution of the beginning of the world. So I'll put the link to the Prelude if you haven't heard it before. It's beautiful. I have one that's set to sort of pictures, and then I also wanted to put the one below that is actually it's a behind the scenes from the Met Opera when they did a Ring production a few years ago, where there's somebody actually describing that Prelude in musically about the beginning of the world. So I just thought that was such a cool analogy that I was just blown away by that. I was blown away by his improvisation explanation to me, but this analogy with the opera was just so cool. So I'll leave the chat at that. I'm about out of time. I need to move on to do a brief kind of overview of what I'm reading now, just to at least show you. Let me just pull up the cover for you so that you have that. Right now I am reading Pyotr Tchaikovsky. This is a criticalized biography by Philip Ross Bullock. This has been really good. This is a very kind of brief biography, and I'm almost finished with it. So I should have a book chat on this coming up fairly soon. But this has been very enriching, especially around, you know, the music of Tchaikovsky, which I've learned a ton about. So yeah, let's get to the drawing for my next work. So if you're not familiar with what I'm doing, I'm reading off of a reading list, and I'm just doing a drawing and letting the randomness of the universe choose my next book. I have 8 works left here, so I will choose one from among the 8 to be my next read after I finish the biography of Tchaikovsky. So here we are. We'll get this one. The Canterbury Tales. The Canterbury Tales. So the selected Canterbury Tales, a new translation by Sheila Fisher. This is a thread left over from last year when I read a mini biography of Geoffrey Chaucer around the pivotal year of 1389, which is the year he started the Canterbury Tales, and I vowed then that I would get the Canterbury Tales read this year, so this is going to be my time to do that. This book, I believe, if I remember right, I chose this one because this particular translation, because it also has the Middle English, and I was really curious to be able to experience the Middle English as well as a modern translation. So that'll be coming up soon after Tchaikovsky. So stay tuned. Until next time, take care. Bye.